Hi everyone, welcome. Yeah, the sun is streaming in, coming in at a really shallow angle into the wormery. Usually that means it's late in the day, and that's a little bit unusual. Usually I'm down here in the wormery to tend to my worm bins in the morning, but today is actually the day that we would normally check in on these to maintain our 14-day feeding interval. These yellow buckets with the European nightcrawlers in them for some time now have been getting tended to every 14 days to receive their feedings. And I guess, one thing we had talked about recently was to maybe make that last feeding they got 14 days ago their last. That was feeding number 20. But you know what? I have not managed to hatch a good plan on what to do with these. So, in keeping what we've done so far for quite some time now, we're going to be getting them up on the bench and getting them fed. So let's get to work. As we usually do, we're starting over here in bucket number 1. Each one has a number and we can distinguish them from each other that way. Not that we would really have to, because we've been able to keep a pretty good consistent thing going on between these systems for the most part. So I don't think that there's a great deal of difference in how they're looking, or at least up until now there hasn't been. This little itsy bitsy fragment of what used to be a coffee filter remains on this side of the bin, signaling to me that that was where we last fed. We were trying to leave our feeding zone indicator, which is customarily a coffee filter in my bins. We were trying to leave it for them slightly submerged beneath the surface in case they would need to come up for that and nibble on a little bit as food. This here looks like it might be a piece of just a chunk of wood. It's very, very firm, kind of hard to break. I don't know. The feedings they've been getting lately, at least for the past, 3 or 4, maybe more feedings, have just been things geared at allowing the system that they're in to remain really nice and free of residue, food scraps or bedding scraps, and that's the reason we've been sticking to using this old coffee filter. Kind of a large object that would be easy enough to pull out as a whole piece, but they're doing quite a bit on breaking it down, as you can see. Not a whole lot left there. I'm even questioning whether we even need to continue showing ourselves where we last fed, because I do really want to get these little guys working on some nice fresh material in a new environment. To leave them in this nice batch of castings also seems unfortunate, since the castings themselves are very nice and it would be kind of nice to harvest here. So what we'll usually do is we'll just check to see how the side of the bin looks where we last fed, make sure everything looks good, and then similarly open up the opposite side of the bin so we can go ahead and administer our feeding. Same type of food as they've been getting till now, just small granular food portion of coffee and worm chow. So the material is quite nice, I must say. Super flowing and granular. No real signs of any clumping, which has been, I guess, my big concern lately. Anytime I've had issues in any of my worm bins where I've experienced sort of die-offs of the populations, I always observed clumping of the material, which would seem to suggest that maybe the only problem there is excess moisture. But somehow it seems to lead to other bad things, and sometimes that really bad thing is just a extremely rapid die-off of the system's population. So it does seem to me like leaving material super granular like this somehow guarantees that we're not going to go down that road. And I can't tell you exactly what the recipe for that is, but the one thing I did do in an attempt to try to reduce or eliminate the possibility of that happening was just to become really generous with bedding in all my systems. So maybe that's the explanation for it, I don't know. I'm really pleased to see the moisture level in this material being so nice for them. We did determine the last time we were in here that the moisture level was just right, so we decided to put those cardboard coverings that are on here now back on and I think they're doing a good job preventing any further moisture from being lost to evaporation. So the food that they're getting is similar to what we've given them recently. It's just a little sprinkling of the worm chow that I make. You might notice that this stuff's a little bit powderier than previous batches. And it might be because I consciously made an effort to try to blend this stuff into a finer consistency. Left it in the blender for a little bit longer than I usually would. I guess I was starting to observe, it was actually in these systems right here, I was starting to observe little things sprouting, and it seemed unusual considering everything they were getting had been ground up into a nice fine worm chow. But then I looked a little bit more closely at my worm chow, and there were little tiny seeds making it through the process, never getting ground up and evidently remaining capable of sprouting. So my aim was to try to make sure that even the tiniest little seeds, the ones that are, I guess, coming into the worm chow via the bird seed that I've been including, just want to make sure every last one of them is ground up nice and tiny into powder, so that we don't continue to see seeds sprouting. You know what, before we cover up, I'm just going to sprinkle a little bit more of this stuff down into here. And that'll be their feeding for today. How does that look? Not bad. I'm trying to keep that coffee filter within view so we can return it to its function of being our feeding zone indicator, despite it being so terribly weathered. In the past we had submerged parts of it so that the worms, if they needed to, could nibble on it as sort of a supplementary carbon food source. But you know, if that really comes to that point that they're so desperate, I assume that the cardboard covering things up here can serve that purpose, and they can nibble on that if they have to. So, on to bucket number 2. Okay, so like I do sometimes, I take a little bit more time on bucket number 1 or system number 1 when we're dealing with multiple systems. And once I sort of get into the groove, I feel like I can sort of step up the pace so we can bang out a similar remedy to the remaining system or systems. So let's see how I do at that today here. Let's see, what do we have? Is this traces of our feeding zone indicator? It could be. Here's another sort of leftover chunk of food, maybe the skin of a tough material, maybe the skin of an avocado shell or something. We did find, oh, that's interesting, a little pile of worms huddling together. Sometimes I worry when I see worms doing that, because they'll do that in response to conditions that are becoming unfavorable for them, maybe too dry. If that is the case, then I don't want to let that sort of slip under the radar. I would want to tend to that as a situation that needs attention. And the material does flow really nicely, but it doesn't seem exceedingly or dangerously dry, although it is a bit drier than the other one was. I'm wondering if, just for the sake of consistency, maybe it would be beneficial to just come in here with the squirt bottle momentarily to dampen things for them, you know? Why don't we do that? Let me go get my squirt bottle. Okay, I made a quick pit stop at the other bucket, at bucket number 1, before coming in here with the spray bottle, because I did want to be fair and give them a little bit too, even though it didn't seem quite so severe over there. Not to say that what we're seeing here is that severe either, I don't think, but a lot of people might actually criticize it as being exceedingly dry, far drier than necessary, and I guess I tend to agree. So let's let's do these little guys a favor and dampen up their material nicely. The other one I just popped in there quickly into bucket number 1 and administered some dampness to the very top surface. Here I felt like maybe since we're going to probably end up giving them just a little bit more than I gave bucket number 1, I sprayed some onto the other side before covering it all up, and then here too I guess we can similarly blend in some of this water just to spread it around pretty evenly. But we'll try to drop in slightly more into this system than we did into the other one. And we'll just use this as a reason to rinse off the glove and the side of the buckets at the same time. I guess when I go to covering up again, my glove is going to get all filthy again. No big deal. Alright, let's get these little guys fed and we'll move on to bucket number 3. Okay. Trying to keep the quantity of food I'm putting into each of these pretty much the same. Trying to be fair. But I've also got only so much coffee here, so I want to make sure I apply it in an amount that permits me to put a similar quantity into each system. Now somehow I felt like we had put a little bit more of the worm chow in right after the coffee went in. We sprinkled just a little bit more in, so why don't we do that here too. That'll be a pretty equal feeding for the first 2 buckets, and we'll try to follow suit in bucket number 3. Alright, I mean, I did see little scraps here and there of the feeding zone indicator, but not nearly as much as we saw in bucket number 1. In fact, this little tiny shred here might be all that remains of it, if that's even it. Alright, let's get this thing covered up and move on. Last but not least, we're visiting in on bucket number 3. There we go. So, once again, I'm kind of expecting similar things here. So here once again, we left a little bit of the feeding zone indicator protruding. What do we have here? Unwelcome guest. Did I get him? It's a little difficult working in cramped spaces like this. You can't hardly see what you're doing. So last time, all right, there we go. Kind of like in bucket number 1, we did manage to retrieve a better portion, a larger portion at least, not better, but bigger portion of the feeding zone indicator, which we'll try to keep tabs on so that we can try to return it into the bucket on top of where the last feeding was to show ourselves where we last were. My sense here too is moisture would be beneficial. So let me let these little guys squirm down into the bed, and then we'll sprinkle in a little bit of water for them too. Okay, perhaps I could be a little bit smarter about applying this moisture. Maybe I'll just dump it down here low, and then I won't handle it. I'll just cover it with the drier stuff that won't stick so much to my glove. And at the same time, these little guys get a quick little shower, kind of like getting caught out in the rain, should they just be roaming the surface. Although, I don't know. I sometimes wonder, do they appreciate getting a little dousing of moisture when we spray directly onto them? I'm sure it's kind of shocking. I'm sure if the water had just come out of the faucet and it was a lot cooler or something, then maybe it would be uncomfortable for them. But it's room temperature. It's just sitting here in my bottle, same temperature as the rest of the room. So my guess is that being introduced to a little extra moisture is something that the worms aren't going to object to in most cases. I guess unless they're being doused into water with a hook in their butt, and then I could see a reason for them being put off by that. But in most cases, I would assume that just getting moisture applied directly to them like this would be something that they don't mind too much. There's another little leftover scrap of something. Yeah, other than the occasional chunk of leftover something, the material is almost all castings. And it's hard to tell if there's leftovers, but after 14 days I would assume that none of the stuff we've been giving them is gonna be leftover. I would assume that they would have eaten every single bit of coffee and warm chow applied during the last check-in 14 days ago, after all that time. So let's give them some more food. Should be a welcome little, oops, oh boy. Welcome little addition. I don't know, maybe we don't have to apply a second sprinkling of the worm chow in here. That pretty much covers, I think what they just got there pretty much covers and is equal to the amount that the other two systems got in two separate little applications. I don't know, is there more worms in here? Maybe they would eat a little bit more. I don't know, I just somehow can't resist. Give them a little bit more. Alright, well, I think that's it. We're pretty much done here. Completing our check-in on the European nightcrawlers. I didn't even take note of, oh boy, we got a little escapee here. Somebody trying to escape. Usually I would assume that the walls of the bin are dry enough that as they make their way up, they eventually realize that there's no moisture, and that going any further is not going to lead them to any more moisture. So that turning back is usually the best option. But I know that I just sprinkled some water in here. So maybe, I don't know, maybe the wet sidewalls of the buckets are something that the worms enjoy climbing on while it's wet, maybe sipping up the little traces of moisture on the walls. Alright, I think I don't know, did we? I wasn't really keeping very good track, but I think we gave a pretty fair amount of liquid moisture to each of these bins, and that brings us to the end of today's check-in. So, hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's also very much appreciated. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.